Let's get underway. My name is Matthew ten Bruggencate. I am a communication officer with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is the home of Earth Negotiations Bulletin, or ENB. ENB has provided neutral, authoritative reporting, daily reporting from climate COPs, but also biodiversity, but also plant genetics, from a variety of environmental and sustainable development negotiations since 1992. And we are here in Baku, in Azerbaijan, on rest day of COP29. And we're thrilled to be joined by Dr. Jennifer Allan, who is on our team reporting from Baku to give you an update of what has happened in week one, what the progress was, what the obstacles were, what we expect from week two. This will be about an hour. The first 20 minutes will be Jen talking about what happened, and then we go to the Q&A. So within Zoom, if you're not familiar with it, there is a little Q&A box at the bottom in the middle. We'll be monitoring the chat, and please feel free to connect with each other and share your questions, observations there. But if you want to pose a question to Dr. Allan, use the Q&A function. And we do request that you be respectful, of course, in the chat. This is being recorded, and we're going to share the recording link with you after the fact. Please feel free to share it forward. If you haven't already, but I think most of you might have as well, please subscribe to ENB Update and you'll get our daily reports and photos in your inbox. I think that covers all of the housekeeping. So Dr. Allan, it's over to you. How did week one go at COP29?
It's a bit tricky, to be honest. So this is a rest day for most of us, but it didn't mean that we necessarily had a whole bunch of sleep. So we're done 1 week, and I think right now I would characterize the COP as maybe in a bit of trouble. It's certainly going slowly would be perhaps the nicest thing to say. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to just remind us where we came from, like what happened last year that matters here, because I think there's a lot of the conversations from last year really kind of seeping in. And then I'll go into what happened last night when the subsidiary bodies closed, because it's a great sort of touch point for where we're at on a bunch of key issues. Then I will talk about the new finance goal, because that really is the deliverable from this COP that everyone is expecting. And then a few other issues like the mitigation work program, the global stock take, and of course, whether or not we may or may not see a cover decision. Usually, so I kind of had a quick look at the attendees, and it seems like there's a few names I recognize that probably know more than I do on some of these things, like carbon markets. There's always a carbon market person on these calls. And there's some people that maybe this might be their first COP, or they might be new and just really interested. So I'm going to try to kind of go at various levels. So if it seems really detailed and jargony, feel free to ask a question in the chat or in the Q&A, or bear with me and I'll try to get to some nerd level details later on if I can. So I think the important thing to remember is last year in Dubai, what was agreed? And it was agreed, oh gosh, I think on the Sunday, not on the Friday when the meeting's supposed to end, to the global stocktake outcome. Now the global stocktake, the Paris Agreement says a few things about it. And more things, more rules and guidelines were kind of elaborated around it in 2018. But there was a whole lot of sort of experimentation in Dubai. And I think that's continuing on now. So in Dubai, they agreed to this global stocktake outcome. The highest profile bit of that was something called the Energy Transition Package. That includes things like tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency capacity, moving towards low carbon energy technologies, things like that. And then the Paris Agreement thinks that the global stocktake is supposed to be a stocktake. It's a look about all countries are doing, where are we at in aggregate? And it's supposed to inform the next pledges, those nationally determined contributions or NDCs. Now, it doesn't say in the Paris Agreement how the GST should inform those new NDCs. So there's a bit of a gap there. And that's the bit that parties were trying to fill up last year. And this year, they're really working on that link. And that's where a lot of the conversations and I think struggles are happening. So that's just a bit of a reminder, because that's going to seep into several of the discussions today, I think, and over the next week, certainly. So last night we were very happy that the subsidiary bodies closed at 12:23 a.m. For people that follow ENB quite a bit, you know that we have a tradition of putting the precise time that that last gavel goes down. So we were happy about that, because it meant we were only at venue till about 2, which is great. It's sometimes been much worse. And the reason why it didn't take so long, even though we started plenary maybe about 9, is that several issues around loss and damage, a couple adaptation issues, they were something called Rule 16, which means that parties couldn't agree really even to say that they produced anything that could go forward to a next time. So it really is the lowest level outcome. So parties can't even agree to a text that said, we considered the matter and we'll consider it next time and we'll forward on all of our work. That won't happen for these issues if they are Rule 16. It means that they lose everything from this session and they start new in June. So there were a few of those last night. One of them, which I'll start with, was the mitigation work program. So mitigation is reducing emissions. It's obviously, one would hope, at the heart of the UN climate response, that we need to radically reduce emissions, preferably before 2030. But those discussions were really difficult. Those negotiations were really just stuck, and really in a way where they couldn't even say that they were constructive in any ways. A lot of mistrust, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blaming. So some countries wanted to see work in the mitigation program around that energy transition package. They said, this is the place where we should figure out really how can we catalyze, how can we enable that energy transition as quickly as possible. And other countries said, oh, that's not what this is for. We didn't agree that the mitigation work program would be doing this. They thought maybe goals like tripling renewable energy capacity were kind of infringing on countries' ability to determine for themselves what will be their climate strategies. So there was this fundamental disagreement about what this mitigation work program should be doing. And so because of that, after lengthy conversations in plenary even, this one ended up Rule 16. But unlike those other ones, it potentially has another life. And we absolutely expect to see this next week. Now, the reason this one has another life is that it's also under the CMA, which is the Paris Agreement's big governing body. And so there's every reason to expect that the UK, Alliance of Small Island States, least developed countries, EU, and several others that spoke up in plenary last night in favor of more discussions on this will try to bring it back next week. So expect conversations around mitigation next week, but it's the same people in the room with the same interests and the same points to make, that progress has been slow and we don't want to see burden shifted onto developing countries, but at the same time, we need a lot of major emitters to start to act. So those are sort of the general points always made. And it's one of these cases where everyone has a point and everyone's right, but that doesn't necessarily lead us to a better outcome. So we'll certainly have more mitigation conversations next week. I'm just not really sure how far they're going to get. Looming with all of this is those pledges, those nationally determined contributions. Now they're due to be resubmitted or updated every 5 years, which means next year we should be seeing some new NDCs come in. Now, technically, again, back to the Paris Agreement, and also the Compliance Committee recently agreed with it, those NDCs are due 9 months before COP. So in spring, we should be seeing new NDCs. But if the UK submitted a new, or said that they would submit a new one, we haven't heard much about this. It's been really sort of a looming silence in the negotiations, that There's not a lot of talk about countries really planning that in the spring, they will have big, ambitious new NDCs to put forward. We also haven't heard anything about maybe if there will be some sort of summit in the spring. So you could think back to, pandemic times. I'm sorry to bring us back. But spring 2021, there was the summit hosted by the US. And there was also a UN Climate Action Summit. They were all online, they were all virtual, but it was a space for countries to announce those NDCs early. We haven't heard anything about that happening. So we're not really sure. Maybe they'll just be happy for them to come to COP, but really they're due 9 months early or before the COP. So those are a couple of things on mitigation, although NDCs include more, they include finance, they include adaptation. But it's sort of a little bit silent right now because we don't know how we'll see that follow up on the energy transition plan. So speaking of follow up, so there is this global stocktake, and there's a dialogue. It's called the UAE Dialogue on Implementing the GST. And then there's a whole bunch more words after that, which I'll get into in a second. And this dialogue was established by the global stocktake itself. The problem is countries don't really agree on its origin story. So where it's written in the GST is in the finance section. So the like-minded group of developing countries and a few others are saying, well, look, ILAC, the Latin American group, they're saying this means it's about finance. It's in the finance section of the decision. So what are we on about? Why are we fighting? The EU and several others saying, well, actually, it's about everything. It's about following up on energy. It's about following up on adaptation. It's about following up on loss and damage. And it's about following up on finance. So we're seeing countries just fundamentally disagree about what they're supposed to be doing on this. And they really are supposed to launch it at this COP and get it going so that we can make sure that Global Stocktake 2 is less of an experiment. Now, the big thing that we want at this COP is a new collective quantified goal on finance. So NCQG. So it's new because it will replace the current goal, which is $100 billion per year from developed countries to developing countries. It's collective because there are hopes that it won't just be developed countries contributing. It's quantified because we need to have a number. They're calling it the quantum in the negotiations, and it's on finance. Now, we worked really hard on this over the week. And the first week is usually technical negotiations. And I think what we saw is that the level of technical work that can be done, the wordsmithing, the crafting, there's only so much they can do. And I think they're at the limit of it until they get political guidance on 3 key questions. The first is, what is that quantum? How much? Now, a lot of developing countries are quite clear on this. It is 1.3 trillion, because that's the estimated needs of developing countries to respond to climate change and to reduce their own emissions. And then other countries, other groups have come forward. So the LDCs, the least developed countries, have said, we have a floor of how much of that should come to least developed countries. Small island states also have their floor. I think they said 39 billion. And then ILAC, the Latin American, or a lot of Latin American countries that speak as a coalition, they said, actually, why don't we do this regionally instead of by, development status or whether you're a small island state. So within that, there's already sort of, how do we spend this money? Developed countries have been very, very quiet on the quantum. They won't give a number of any sort. I've heard things from EU, from US saying, it will be hundreds of billions for providing public finance and mobilizing finance. And then they want something that they're calling an investment layer. So you can imagine a core of public finance and then a layer around it. And that layer will be for investment. So how do you get private actors essentially to invest in actions that will help reduce emissions, build resilience, possibly address loss and damage. So that, they said, would be in the trillions. Now that is as close as we've come to getting any sort of sense of an actual number from developed countries. The second one, and this is what that quantum will be played off of. So this is sort of the ultimate trade-off, is quantum and contributor base. The Paris Agreement has a phrase in there, which was very hard fought. It originated from a bilateral agreement with the US and China. And even in the very last hours of Paris, there was a big huddle on the floor because there was a worry about this. And it was that developed countries and those in a position to do so will contribute. Now that those in a position to do so is very much what's up for debate. So there's a lot of pushback that developing countries are saying no. It also says in the Paris Agreement that developed countries take the lead and that this is an obligation of developed countries. And let's not forget, we're not entirely sure that they've even met this 100 billion. They didn't meet it by 2020 when they were supposed to, didn't meet it in 2021 or 2022. They think, hopefully, that it was met in 2023. But that depends on who you ask and what estimates, because there is no common definition of what counts as climate finance. And so estimates range wildly. The estimate from the OECD is more than double the estimate from Oxfam. So depending on what one you look at, maybe that goal wasn't met. And so there's a real lack of trust about finance and whether or not we can expect to see countries come through. And so you can imagine that now some developing countries are being asked to pay, but they're not even sure that if they contribute, that their developed country partners will also contribute. So this lack of trust is really hurting the negotiations, in my view. Now, the third question that really we need the ministers, these political guidance masters to help out with is who's going to be eligible for this? And is that eligibility going to change maybe, depending on some sort of eligibility criteria? So that's another big question to ask. So there's really big, meaty, inherently political questions that need to be addressed before those technical negotiators can move much further. They made some progress today on access to make sure that it's easier to access these funds, because right now it's really difficult. They've made some progress, not as much on how are we going to report and track, so we know with some confidence that we are hopefully getting the amount of finance to where it needs to go. But otherwise, they're really kind of waiting for those big pieces to be in place. So that's what we need to see next week. This will keep going. My guess, and this is just a guess, is that we may see sort of a political track to start addressing those big quantum contributor eligibility questions. And then maybe that will hopefully feed some guidance in to let those technical negotiators work on, say, the transparency reporting arrangement. That's just my guess, but it does seem like we need to start getting that political guidance in. So hopefully, I mean, we could probably all have a debate about what would be a successful outcome on this one. If we can get those big questions answered, which I don't know if we can, then maybe there's work next year to finalize some of the transparency and other arrangements. But this is something that was supposed to be in place by 2025. So if it's not this year, it has to be next year. So let's hope we can get the big things in place at least this year. I was going to say Article 6. I'll leave that in case there is a carbon market person, and then we can try to make it make sense. Ages ago, I was a carbon market person, and now I feel like I have no idea what they're saying anymore. So there's something called a cover decision, and this is probably sort of the last substantive point. This is something that's kind of a new invention in a way. I think really 2019 was the first go at this type. So what it is a decision that doesn't come from an agenda item. It's usually the COP presidency that says, okay, we need another place to talk about some issues that are of interest to everybody. Let's work it out and let's have an extra decision, essentially. So there's no mandate, it's wide open, which makes it really hard. It makes it very difficult to negotiate when countries can plop in whatever they want. I have seen everything suggested for cover decisions, from having no decision to talking about carbon colonialism and carbon budgets. I mean, it's a huge range that could be in there, right? So these are really difficult to do. And so some people think that maybe it's a good idea to have a cover decision like we've had in recent years, to get mitigation there and follow up on that energy transition package. Now, the thing is, you have to have something that's in this process called balance. So if you have a mitigation decision, then you have to have adaptation in there. You have to have finance, technology, probably response measures. There's a whole range of things that then will be added in. And it's not clear really in a lot of those areas what we need to have in a cover decision. It's not really clear what could be added in there that isn't already being or should be addressed. Or is this just going to be another area to fight about things that they're fighting about in other rooms, like the mitigation work program? So I don't know if we're going to have one. It's up to the presidency and it's up to parties. The presidency, let's not forget, Azerbaijan never really fought hard for this COP. It was sort of by default that we really needed a host. And it's a country that doesn't have the huge diplomatic capacity of, say, France, the UK, countries that have hosted recently. So it would be a big ask and a big push for them, because essentially they need to dedicate a few members of their team to this. So I'm not sure they're so keen on a cover decision. So parties might have to really push them, and I just don't know if it'll happen. So maybe, maybe not is as good of an answer on that as I can give you. So we're heading into week 2. We have a slew of issues that have been sent on to the presidency, including a few that we don't really expect to see. So usually, for example, gender is an issue that usually is sorted by the technical negotiators in week 1, and away we go, you know. But in Egypt, I think also in 2019 in Madrid, in the Chile Madrid COP, in the Egypt COP, and here, it's now a week 2 issue. And so there's been some language bracketed. Brackets mean that countries now say they can't agree to it. That is language that they agreed to in the past around gender responsive climate action, around women and girls, around Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women and Indigenous girls' rights. So we've seen across various items, language around gender being increasingly contentious. We've also seen across various items attempts to change the language of Indigenous peoples to Indigenous communities, which is very different. It views then Indigenous peoples as stakeholders rather than as rights holders. And so that's something that the Indigenous peoples constituency is really keeping an eye on and very worried about. So sort of across the board, these human rights related issues are becoming more and more difficult and a little bit more ingrained. So that's now on the presidency's agenda. So those national adaptation plans, which the COP presidency I don't think really wanted to have to do next week, because it has a lot on its plate already. And so we're looking at a very busy second week. And so we may see a couple of these big things, maybe the GST dialogue, maybe the goal on finance. Those could land and we could say, all right, this was a successful COP. I think we'll probably get in the middle where we have watered down decisions on several things that leaves nobody happy. There is a chance that countries say, you know what, no deal is better than a bad deal. I don't know if that's a failure. We'll have to really look at what it is at the end of the day, because if no deal is better than a bad deal, maybe it's not a failure to just say, look, we have to take a hard look sometimes at this process. and figure what we all collectively want out of it. It does mean that the Brazilian presidency next year will be far busier than they expect it to be. But yeah, that might be that they are going to inherit issues that they perhaps aren't expecting yet. But partly that's what they sign up for whenever you want to be a COP president. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm curious to hear what people think, what their questions are, anything they're worried about. Yeah, it can be as technical or not technical as you like.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're going to go to your questions. Again, thank you for a really lively chat, and it's great to see people chiming in with their thoughts and their expertise from around the world, because it takes a community to move this forward. With that said, please, if you have a question, use the Q&A function just for organizational ease. I think this one will just explain a bit more about the NCQG. The question is, if the new NCQG is actually 1.3 trillion, is it realistic to expect developed countries to actually give this money every year, especially if the US is not chipping in the next 4 years? So maybe what goes into the NCQG and what is the timeline for it? Yeah.
Yeah. So the NCQG, when they say 1.3 trillion, that might be per year, or they might set a different timeline. And if it is 1.3 trillion, and I think developed countries realize the word trillion has to be there, right? But if it is 1.3 trillion, a bunch of that isn't going to be provided by developed countries to developing countries. They're going to be relying on that investment layer, getting private actors to invest. I understand why there's a lot of hesitancy around that, because take, for example, solar energy in Africa. I mean, Africa to me seems like a place where solar energy could do pretty well. You know, I'm from Northern Canada, and I currently live in very cloudy, rainy Wales. So to me, Africa seems like a solar power heaven, enormous capacity and potential there. But Africa gets about 1 to 2% of solar investment every year. And it's because there's high costs of capital. It's because credit rating agencies have given the country lower scores, and so it's viewed as a risk. So that investment layer, if that is providing hundreds of billions of this to get us to trillions, that will be unevenly distributed. And we don't know if that will be per year or not. And in terms of the US, it's funny. So the US has been an unreliable partner since the get-go. You know, they've never really been, they're either very hot or very cold on climate. And I think people would like them to be around and maybe lukewarm at best. But they've not really been a massive climate finance provider. Really, it's the EU has done the bulk of climate finance, and then kick in Norway and a few others. There's an enormous amount of south-south climate finance that flows, not through the UN system. Most climate finance doesn't flow through the UN climate system. But yeah, the US isn't a giant contributor. So as much as we would like to see the US reduce emissions and provide more, we're not necessarily seeing that happen as yet.
In terms of country commentary, I'm going to do a trifecta of Papua New Guinea, of Argentina, and of the United States, all of which are reacting differently. But I guess how is Papua New Guinea not attending? The US very likely pulling out, and Argentina definitely pulling out. How is that impacting the dynamics in the room and impacting the negotiation items that we're following?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Papua New Guinea, they tend to have a presence. They're in the coalition of rainforest nations. They speak sometimes. But, you know, I don't know if that's really impacted in terms of what Papua New Guinea is doing or not doing here. Sorry. Argentina, I mean, that was a bit of a surprise. They sent less than or fewer than 20 delegates, I think. And then midway through the COP, were sent home or asked to leave. And I did notice last night, Argentina is in a coalition of countries with Brazil and Uruguay and a few others called Grupo Sur. And last night, when the Brazilian lead negotiator for that group, spoke. She listed the countries and she did not list Argentina. So I think Argentina might be out, which is a shame. Traditionally, Argentina has been a country that has played really key roles, including the chair that led to the Kyoto Protocol was Argentinian. And so that's a shame to see. And the US, I mean, probably Trump might decide to leave the Paris Agreement. Maybe he decides he has other things to do. Kind of what I've heard here is that it would absolutely be a shame. There are hopes that an awful lot of climate action is actually in the power of states in the US because it's quite a decentralized system, and that some of the policies that have been put in have created sort of markets for renewables, for example, that seem like they look like they would continue regardless of continued government support. So it might be that the US continues to be sneaky climate actor, is I think the optimists are hoping that. We've been through this before. We've been through this several times before with the US. And I think there's a sense sort of, yeah, okay, here we are again. We've done it before, we'll do it again. We'll wait to see if the US comes back sometime. I think people are just sort of a little bit, they want to get off the roller coaster, maybe is the way to put it.
Has the G20 meeting come up at all, or have you noticed that impacting negotiations at all?
It's kind of statements. It's interesting. So one thing that ties maybe this question to the last is there have been questions about, is the COP fit for purpose? There is a letter published this week to that effect. And people are saying, no, we're not getting the results that we want to see. And so some look, and this has happened before, this happened in the late 2000s as well, that people say, well, what about the G20? Why can't the G20 do this? Because you have 85-ish, I mean, look up that number, I'm half remembering it, percent of emissions is from G20 countries. So why can't the G20 come up with an agreement to reduce emissions? And I think there's a lot of value to that. I think the G20 could be very influential. There's limits. The G20 has a different presidency that sets different priorities every year. It's all done through these Sherpa tracks, so there's a little bit less transparency there. The big weakness is it's the powerful countries. So where would a Papua New Guinea or a Bahamas or Barbados say, look, how are you going to protect us from loss and damage that we're facing? And they wouldn't have a voice in the G20, and that's still the value of COP in my eyes. So G20's come up here and there, not as much. I think it's kind of strange. Like I personally, maybe others on the call will know better. I personally can't remember a G20 meeting being during a COP, at least not in recent years. And so that seems a bit interesting to me, that the timing on it. So perhaps something comes out of that suddenly helped at COP, but we have to wait to see what comes out of that.
You were maybe hoping that this wouldn't come up, but indeed, there are carbon market people on this call. Where are we at with 6.2? Where are we at with Article 6.4? Where there's perhaps a perception by some people on the call that things are in a bit of limbo. So if you could give what information is possible on these very complex negotiations.
Carbon markets are funny because I think the negotiators in the carbon market room, they've been together for so long and they're so detailed, like they are in the weeds of the weeds, the little flowers on the top of the weeds, that sometimes they struggle to articulate, here's actually what we're struggling with in terms of something that their heads of delegation or their ministers can understand. There was a ministerial on Article 6, I think over the late summer or maybe in September. And the ministers had no idea, they couldn't understand this. So we did kick off COP with an Article 6 decision. And it's been a bit controversial, to be honest. So it was the decision on removals. And so what happened was, countries have been stuck on this in the negotiations for a while, especially with sort of a fight between US and EU. And so what happened was the supervisory body for Article 6 said, we'll sort it, and we're going to call it a standard and methodologies, which means it's in our purview to do, and then we'll submit it as a decision. And the COP presidency really wanted a decision, like a win on the first day. And so it was adopted. And there's been countries upset about that since, saying, look, you know, this is party-driven process. What's going on? But as always with Article 6, there's more to do. So 6.2, the conversation there is largely around registries. So how are we going to record all the transactions that are going to happen? And there's a lot of countries with limited capacity that want to participate in the carbon market, but don't necessarily want to set up their own registry for all of this, especially if, like other forms of investment, they're not really expecting to have a really busy market. So whether or not there can be an international market or international registry. So there's been some agreement that, yeah, okay, let's do that. But then what does that look like? And how does it avoid, you know, allowing for double counting while not creating a huge burden on the countries, things like that. 6.4, where are they stuck on? I can't remember. 6.4, I think, actually, yeah, I can't remember. Totally gone. It's gone from my tired brain. I'm very sorry, carbon market people. If you email me, I can find the answer for you. Sorry.
It has been a long week, and Article 6 is a absolutely a tough one. A little bit of a window into climate finance, because this is a big finance year, and what you can share about. Well, my question is, how does the framework on climate finance established under international agreements function in practice? What mechanisms ensure that financial commitments are effectively mobilized, equally distributed, transparently monitored to address the needs? So how is the system watched, put under the microscope?
Yeah, it's a great question. So remember, we're replacing the 100 billion goal. And that 100 billion goal was literally agreed to by a handful of countries in Cancun in 2010, announced by then US Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. And then later, they had no idea what the heck this meant. There was never a roadmap for how they would ramp up to 100 billion. There was never an agreement about here's what the sources of finance would be, or here's what would count. So there was nothing on it. And that really did hurt negotiations for a long time and undermine trust. So they're trying to do better this time. So there's a whole bunch of things that come out of the Standing Committee on Finance. They do an awful lot of very good work. So this year just alone, they produced what's called the Biennial Assessment on Climate Finance Flows. And that really is a compilation of here's everything we know about climate finance and where it's flowing and to who and in what form. This is huge. So most climate finance comes in the form of a loan that countries have to pay back. So countries are going into debt for taking climate action. It's one of the fundamental things that developing countries want to see changed in this new goal. And so they're trying to do this better through getting this biennial assessment report. They just this year published the second determination of developing country needs report. So they're trying to be a bit more sciencey about this. There is reporting. So countries under the Paris Agreement have to report on the finance that they provide or the climate finance that they receive. So there is sort of a growing amount of tracking that happens. The Green Climate Fund, it does its bit. The Global Environment Facility does its bit. So it's becoming an awful lot better. There's still more to be done. And that's why as part of this new goal, they are talking about what are the transparency, what's the reporting arrangements to make sure that funds are flowing where we think they should, and that the funds are of the quality that we want. So that grants versus loan question is really big.
Questions from those following adaptation. The global goal on adaptation was bumped back. Why? Why have adaptation talks been so fraught? If you could give a window into some of the dynamics there.
You can try. Yeah. Adaptation is really hard. And to some extent, I wonder if, all the attention to loss and damage lately has kind of sucked the attention away from adaptation, which is a shame because if we do adaptation better, then there's less loss and damage. Global goal and adaptation, there's a few things. One is partly, I wonder if it's being used as a bit of a bargaining chip, to be honest. Unfortunately, that does happen at these meetings. There's also some really kind of fundamental disagreements about how we're going to go about developing indicators to measure the global goal against, and whether or not its countries should use their NAPs, their national adaptation plans, whether or not they should use their NDCs, how that may or may not affect the support that they're given to do this. But at the end of the day, the biggest challenge in my mind, and I think why these talks across the board, well, I think there's two reasons why the adaptation talks have been stuck. The first is that adaptation is about, or treating the process like it's about planning. We need more plans. We need the LDCs to do their plans. We need to be able to measure progress towards the global goal. And there's been very little movement on supporting actual resilient action. There's promises to double adaptation finance. But again, they didn't specify, say, a baseline. So they don't agree on what that actually means. And adaptation is something where you can't make a great business case for it. There isn't a great return on investment for it. So it really does have to be public finance. So I think that's one challenge, is that it's been all about let's do the planning and less about let's support actual action. I think the second thing is, and it's less for the GGA, but hopefully a bit too, there's this weird debate happening here. And it's been louder at this COP than I've heard it in the past, where countries don't seem to agree about, and this is going to be boring and legal, so I'm sorry, this is just probably for the lawyers for the next 30 seconds. So we have the COP that serves the UN Framework Convention, and then we have the CMA that's for the Paris Agreement. And so developed countries are saying, but the Paris Agreement isn't under the convention, so it's fine, it can just be under CMA. And developing countries think, wait a minute, the Paris Agreement was adopted by a COP decision. It's underneath the Framework Convention, which means that principles like common but differentiated responsibilities applies. And so there's been this fight, and that kind of seeped into matters related to least developed countries, into NAPs a bit. And so it's just been this really weird thing that's happening. And I need to chat with more delegates to really understand fundamentally why, because I just don't get it. I just don't get, I kind of understand why it matters for various countries. But ultimately, I also just, from a legal standpoint, it's under the convention. Like, I just don't understand. So I think that's partly what's holding up adaptation as well. And I think maybe there's just a little bit less attention on it. And so it can kind of just be used in a way that gives it a bit of bargaining chip.
On the NCQG, on broadening that donor base, i.e. countries or contributions rather, from major emitter or emerging economies, affluent petrostates, etc. Any signs of progress on that? What has been the tone of conversation around broadening that donor base away from the annex, non-annex fault line?
This is why developed countries want the Paris Agreement to not be under the convention, is it gets rid of that Annex 1, non-Annex 1 thing. I wish I could tell you how those conversations are, but to my knowledge, they haven't happened yet. Or if they have, they've happened on phone calls between developed countries. But it has been absolutely silent. And this is why we really need the ministers next week to sort this. Sooner is better. But yeah, absolutely silent on that.
Somebody asking about the Just Transition Work Program, just asking for an update of if that's moving forward or not. How are the talks going on it?
Slow. They are moving forward in a way. So unlike the mitigation work program, at least there is a text going forward, and countries could agree that, all right, we can talk about it next week. So we have to talk about it next week. Now, technically, we're halfway through a 2-year dialogue on just transition, so there should be a way to kind of keep it going and figure out what to do with it. But countries want it to be more, and some developed countries especially are saying, like the EU is saying, well, this should also be following up on the energy transition outcomes from GST. We need the GST to be kind of mainstreamed throughout all of the different work programs and bodies and da-da-da. So that's where that's stuck, is to what extent should this be about ensuring workers' rights, ensuring social inclusion, and we're not leaving anyone behind as we transition away from fossil fuels. And that is absolutely where they're stuck, is how much are we focusing on energy?
I want to ask a question for me. And about COP30. You've talked already about the NDCs being due next year. Can you remind us perhaps what is due for COP30? What are we expecting there? But then also your observations about how Brazil has been acting in these negotiations as the incoming presidency, if they've been engaging with the current presidency, that troika that made the news for a certain amount of time. Just how are they looking to pick up the baton?
It's interesting. So the Brazilians always have a huge delegation, and this year more so than usual. Yeah, so a couple of things. So it's NDCs is the big thing, of course, due in spring, but probably we'll see them at COP. That's a shame, really, because they're supposed to be confidence builders. But so there's the NDCs, that's really the big thing. Brazil also has the G20 presidency, so there might be a really unique opportunity to use both of these processes and get them to work together. Brazil's been really active in terms of having a strong voice for the global South, and really kind of having a voice that's trying to bridge where they can, but without giving up much, really, in terms of being a strong voice for the global South. The meeting, and I've been thinking about this a lot since we're in Azerbaijan and in Baku. The next COP is in Belém, which is, from my understanding, a city of about 1 million people up in the Amazon. And I wonder if it's big enough. This is the second largest COP ever, even though it was supposed to be smaller. 70,000 people registered. They're expecting roughly 60,000 to attend over the 2 weeks. They're building hotels in Belém. I don't know what happens to those after everyone from COP leaves, and it's more difficult to get to. And so while the Brazilians have a huge diplomatic capacity, you know, the Brazilians are known for having a really strong foreign service. I personally just worry if 70,000 people coming to Belém might harm the Amazon as much as maybe we're seeking to bring people to the Amazon to save it. I really sort of have a deep worry about the ecosystem effects of these huge COPs.
A question that also turned up at the biodiversity COP. Can you explain the difference between indigenous peoples and local communities or indigenous communities? Can you explain the differentiation between those terms and why that matters at COP29?
Yeah, there's the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that defines all of the rights of Indigenous peoples as rights holders. So not as just having a stake, not just sort of having a voice, but as rights holders. And to water that down then by saying they're Indigenous communities takes away those rights. There is the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. And when that was being negotiated, years ago, I think, after Paris, it really is difficult because they couldn't define what a local community is. And they left it there, they left it open. And I think partly that happened because countries have different systems for recognizing Indigenous people. And so to some extent, local communities was a way to kind of try to be inclusive. But yeah, so really it comes down to the rights that Indigenous peoples have when we actually use the words Indigenous peoples. And so that is coming up in talks around least developed countries. So adaptation, because we know Indigenous peoples are conserving much of our ecosystems. They're doing important work around climate adaptation, and they're knowledge holders that could tell us a lot about our world that we don't see through sort of modern science, quote unquote science. So it really is difficult then if we don't label people with the proper terms and as Indigenous peoples, we're essentially taking away rights.
Well, we're actually referencing very briefly the biodiversity conference. How has CBD COP16 come up, if at all, in the negotiations? That was a large conference just a couple of weeks ago in Colombia, larger than I think we anticipated it being, and gathered quite a lot of attention around the global biodiversity framework and addressing another environmental crises, biodiversity loss.
Yeah, we have all these crises these days. Yeah, it's interesting. So there's so much overlap here when we think about it from any perspective that's not UN legal perspectives. We could think about how climate change impacts nature, how nature-based solutions can help protect ecosystems and address climate change. We can think of all of these things that can be done on the ground that's good for nature and good for the climate. And then you get up to this world, and it's like one forgets that the other exists. It's different people. It's sometimes even different departments in governments that they send. So biodiversity hasn't come up that much. There was a side event, and actually EMB covered it as our side events team, where the UN system kind of said, hey, here's what we're trying to do as the UN system to bring together these and coordinate. But it's like they're in these legal silos and they don't really think about this going across. One area that maybe we could look for in the NDCs that are coming up is to what extent are they referencing nature and nature-based solutions or Indigenous peoples or conservation? You know, are they actually at the government level thinking about this? Because, you know, at the local level, it makes sense. Are they doing it at a government level? And then maybe it feeds into this international level. So maybe it's something to look for in these NDCs when we get them.
Are there any discussions? How is it coming up that we have almost crossed 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming? Considering last year's global temperatures, we might be blowing past that. How has that been coming up? And perhaps I'll springboard off that as well. How is the science coming up and impacting the talks?
It's definitely coming up. I mean, the opening statements, many countries reference 1.5. And it's, you know, we were saying in Glasgow, we got to keep 1.5 alive. And then I think someone said it's on life support. I've still heard the phrase 1.5 alive, but not as often, to be honest. Instead, I've heard things like every fraction of a degree matters, which it does. I just really hope that doesn't mean we're giving up on 1.5. So yeah, it's coming up. It's definitely coming up a lot. In terms of how science is recognized, there's a few agenda items that tend to fall under the radar. So one is research and systematic observation. And this is what's on the tin, is dealing with research. And so one thing that it does every year is looks at all the reports that are produced about the global climate, like from the IPCC, from the World Meteorological Organization, and on. And it welcomes these reports and it recognizes that these reports matter. In recent years, I'd say since 2018, it's been more difficult. Like instead of welcoming these reports, suddenly now we're noting them, maybe with appreciation. Like there's been this watering down a bit. And the fight that we had this week was whether or not to say 2024 is the hottest year on record. So there's been several outlets in terms, like especially the World Meteorological Organization, that says, look, 2024 is going to be the hottest year on record. And a couple countries pushed back on that and said, well, we don't know yet, November. So yeah, so I think maybe that text got in. I can't remember offhand. You could probably have a look. But yeah, it's been difficult on the science front lately. Things that used to be just taken for granted, like welcoming these reports, has been a little bit harder.
Thank you all for your incredible chat and questions. We are rapidly coming to the end of our time, so we're going to try and do what we can. But a question I want to get in, heading into week 2, can you remind us about the rhythm of week 2 to expect? What should people be looking for? What moments should they especially be expecting, you know, the rubber to hit the road, whatever metaphor you want to use for movement on some of these items?
Yeah, we'll definitely find this out tomorrow, Monday. We actually were supposed to find it out yesterday, last night. The presidency had promised that right after the technical negotiations, the subsidiary bodies close, that he would provide an update and the plan for week 2. So we don't have that yet. Usually what happens is we do see some of the technical negotiations keep going. So I think that would happen on national adaptation plans, for example, because they were really, really close. So that will happen. So we'll see some of that. We'll see probably Monday, and then certainly by Wednesday, ministerial co-facilitators. So it means that for different issues, 2 ministers, one from the global north, one from the global south, will be paired up to work on issues. And they're going to lead negotiations on, I'm assuming, NCQG, the global stock take, just transition, things like that. The formats can vary. So sometimes they will hold sort of a ministerial consultation with a whole bunch of the people in the same room. Increasingly, they've been doing shuttle diplomacy, it's called, where you go talk to one group, come back, talk to another group, come back, and then float something with the first group, It's really tricky, that, because you have to make sure you've checked everything with every group, and then it also means no one knows what's happening. So because of that, there will be presidency stock takings. Hopefully it will be regular or on a regular basis. From Wednesday until, I don't know, in this end, Saturday, Sunday, it's a lot of waiting around. It's a lot of plenary will start at 6 and then maybe it starts at 8. Yeah, it's a lot of overnights and waiting to see what happens, because it's really difficult to find out, because it tends to go underground, as they say. That'll happen from about Wednesday and then until this meeting ends, to be honest. The record is 44 hours overtime, and I certainly hope we're not challenging that. So yeah, we'll find out on Monday exactly what the plan is, but it's sort of that high-level political engagement means a little bit less access for everybody, including us.
Do you have your bet in yet for the EMB betting pool about when this meeting ends?
I don't. We usually set the bets on Thursday. I tend to be the pessimist, so I don't know. I'll buck up for something on Sunday.
I guess to go back to a point about optimism. Yesterday we said in the EMB update, you know, the overall picture appears grim. Is that unprecedented at this point in negotiations, recognizing that we're moving from technical to down, the ministers getting involved? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there is sort of a usual rhythm to these COPs, and it is often that these things do look a bit dire midway through. They either look like everything's trucking along okay, or everything is awful. There's usually nothing in between. This is on the awful stage. And I think partly for me, it's worrisome that there are issues going to week 2, like gender, like NAPS, that we wouldn't have expected to, and that the presidency probably wasn't expecting. Like, I'm sure the presidency wasn't expecting to deal with gender in week 2. Like, that's just not common. So it means that we're really pushing hard on that capacity of the presidency. And we're going to be pushing hard on an awful lot of ministers to be doing a good amount of engagement and guidance. So to me, that feels extra dire, just a bit.
Thank you so much for this is Dr. Allan. This is Jennifer's day off. and she comes in to do the halfway point webinar, and I'm very grateful. And I thank you for your kind comments in the chat. I know everybody is very grateful. That is all for us from Baku for today. But please follow ENB throughout, and thank you for sharing your expertise, your questions, and wherever you are in the world, please have the very best evening, very best day, very best morning, wherever you are, take good care. We'll see you soon.